SaaS Backwards is sponsored by Austin Lawrence Group, specializing in demand gen for SaaS. It sure is noisy. I deleted 100 emails from vendors just this morning. Your buyer has gotten better at ignoring you, and you're gonna need a big idea if you want to cut through all that clutter. Austin Lawrence is just the right agency to help you find it. So if your campaigns are falling on deaf eyeballs, let's talk. Visit austinlawrence.com today and let's build something bigger.
Welcome to the SaaS Backwards podcast, where we reverse engineer the success of fast-growing SaaS firms and explore strategies CMOs and CEOs are using to drive their businesses forward.
Welcome to SaaS Backwards, a podcast that helps SaaS CEOs and CMOs to accelerate growth and enhance profitability. Our guest today is Jonathan Fields, CEO and co-founder of Assembly, a SaaS employee recognition, engagement, and rewards platform for small and medium-sized businesses. Hey, Jonathan, welcome to the podcast.
I'm thrilled to be here. Thanks for having me.
Likewise, looking forward to a great episode with you. But before we dig in, could you please tell our listeners a little bit more about yourself and your company?
Yeah, I'm Jonathan Fields. I'm a Marina Del Rey native, live by the beach, enjoy the romantic sunset walk by the ocean. And about the company, to give a little context, we're an employee recognition, rewards, and engagement platform. And the truth is, in today's world where asynchronous work has become popularized, people aren't in the office all the time. If you don't have a reason to engage with the company, the truth is you're probably looking for another job. And we're the tool that helps companies not only connect coworkers to one another, but connects coworkers to the mission and the values of the organization.
Well, that's a really important point, and it's something I think maybe small and mid-sized businesses face even more than larger ones. I think many SMBs have given up their offices, right? So there's remote or certainly a lot of hybrid work. And I think it also there's like a sort of how old you are impact of this trend too. Like, it's not something we prepped about, but I'm certainly concerned as a business owner about how do I enculturate and mentor and grow early career workers. And I'm wondering if there's an implication in a positive way of using a platform like Assembly on that scenario.
Yeah. So when you think about what do people want in the office, we actually run a pretty big survey at the end of every year. We ask people, what does culture mean? And the results are pretty consistent. People want to feel recognized, appreciated, and acknowledged for their hard work. Right? If you're not feeling appreciated, you're going to look for another job. They want mentorship, as you mentioned quite eloquently. They want career development opportunities. They want to know there's progression available at the organization. If there's no upward mobility, once again, you're probably looking for a new job. You want all the little things. You want the rewards, the company swag, you want the in-person events. But I will say, since the pandemic and hybrid work, there's been a trend that is pretty shocking. All of those things have been consistent. They've been consistent for a long time. But the one thing we're seeing on the survey is the concept of a work best friend. And we're seeing since the beginning of the pandemic, it didn't really exist, but it's skyrocketed in comparison to all the other questions on the survey. If you do not have someone you can collaborate with and consider your work best friend, truth is work becomes transactional. And if it's transactional, you'll look for the job that pays you slightly more money.
That's a fascinating concept. So in my career, I've had partners in my business before, and we were sort of work spouses, right? As owners of the business. But I don't think we projected that idea into the team, like our own concept of how our teammates, the people that worked for us, related to the work. And I'm wondering, is this kind of a unique idea that you guys have uncovered, or are other people talking about work best friends?
I'm not sure if people are calling it specifically a work best friend like the way we're describing it. However, I'm sure at your company, especially if it was in person, people would go to happy hours, people would collaborate, people would go into break rooms or, work together on a project until they knocked it out. But you would get that interpersonal communication that is hard to do on the screen. So if you're looking at me right now, you can't tell how tall I am. You can't tell whether my legs are bouncing up or down. You can't tell a lot of the interpersonal things that you would get by meeting me in person. So if you can create a dynamic between a coworker that is beyond just the job description, you're going to get more engagement out of that person. It's just hands down the way it is. So you can call it what you want. We like to frame it as a work best friend, but you do need some reason outside of just pay to want to work at the organization to stay there.
It's a fascinating thing. I witnessed it with my wife. Her work best friend left the company she was working for, and it decontented work for her. I mean, it made the work just that much less valuable to her day, right? Forget the money. It was just not as enjoyable and took a lot of the fun out of it for her. So I think you're onto something with that. But let's go from the identification of the dynamic then to, is there a way to facilitate those relationships through assembly? Like, how does that work?
Yeah. So you have to think, if you're not in person, how do you create opportunities for coworkers to interact with one another? And the truth is, most companies have very different types of people. You might have introverts, you might have extroverts, you might have baby boomers, millennial, Gen Z, you might have a back office accountant with 6 cats who's just not social. So if there are different types of people on a spectrum, especially with, are they technology savvy? Are they technologically challenged? Where do you sit on the spectrum? There's a lot of different factors that go into it. So that means all people are different. So one size fits all doesn't work. So you need to match people where they're at. So one of the core features and functionality of Assembly is peer-to-peer recognition, manager down recognition. We do it in an automated way that illuminates the recognition publicly. So even if you're not together, 2 coworkers help each other, it's illuminated on this public wall where everyone can see it, comment, react. It just breaks down communication silos and illuminates the little wins. Through the platform, we have a form builder. So any type of form you could set up to be recurring. So a lot of common use cases in Assembly is actually like a connection with your manager, career progression, a weekly check-in. We're not a performance management tool, but a lot of companies use us for that lightweight interactions between their manager, their boss, so on and so forth. And just that single touch point on a recurring basis does add a lot of value to employees. But then in terms of more of the work best friend, how do we create that asynchronously? We create opportunities with all what we call our channels, our culture ideas. So 8 out of 10 families now have a pet, and that happened during the pandemic. So not that we're meant to be a social media tool, but people end up creating these like pets channels or these volunteer channels where people can show off the work that they're doing on their free time, or they can show off their mini golden doodle. You might be shocked, but you have a golden doodle, I have a golden doodle. Okay, we live relatively close. Let's go dog walking together. All of a sudden you create interaction opportunities between coworkers that are beyond just the work environment. Or maybe companies have a more serious tone and they don't want a pets channel or a social channel. Maybe they highlight your favorite company moments, and people can upload videos and files and photos of all the great things that they've done at the organization, and people can operate that way. Ironically, we work with a lot of construction companies, and they might show like almost like a Facebook feed of their best completed work, where people can highlight, it is completely work related, but they're like, oh, that's an amazing project. Can you show me how you did that? Or, what it took to get that done. Creating and facilitating opportunities for coworkers to connect with one another is vitally important in an organization. And it can mean a lot of different things.
Well, I really appreciate you making that real for people, because I think a lot of us in the SMB space, my business included, we struggle with how do we layer on opportunities to engage beyond Zoom or Slack, because those are the places we do it right now. And certainly as a business owner, I'm a little confounded by that idea of culture, and also onboarding the early career people who, in this business, they are the driving energy. The early career staff really drive a lot of the energy in the business. Hey, let's turn to some of the topics we thought we were going to talk about. I'd love to know about the first couple of years where this was sort of a side hustle, sort of a moonlighting kind of thing. How did that work out? And it seems like it took some time. So how did you kind of keep it going over what looks like it was like 3 years, right?
Yeah. So to give a little backstory, it might be helpful to know why we started it. So I was originally an investment banker, and everyone thinks about that job. It is a sexy job if you're in the finance world. You buy companies, you raise money, you do all these glorious things. But the truth is, the culture at the investment bank that I was at was miserable. Like really just miserable. Nobody was happy. Of course, there's career progression and there's money, but that does not make you happy. In fact, I would say it's some of the most unhappy people I've worked with. And early in my career, I transitioned to a company called ZipRecruiter. Now, when I joined ZipRecruiter, it's a massive organization now. It was about 15 people then. And there were some wild things. There was like kombucha on tap and healthy food snacks. There were nap pods. There were career progression opportunities, mentorship opportunities, so many events outside of the work. It was in office back then. There wasn't really the concept of remote work, at least when I started. And the dichotomy between the two cultures had a tremendous impact on me, not only in my career, but like just mentally. If you're around happy people and you're winning, it's an amazing feeling. And so as the company grew, and it grew exponentially, went from 15 people to over 1,000 in IPO, by the time I left. And all throughout that time, we started adopting new technology suites. There were people specifically dedicated, HR business partner, people leaders. There was so much resources going into making sure the culture was incredible. It was intentional. And so there was recognition tools, there were reward tools, there were performance feedback, there were daily questionnaires that could spark discussion topics that would go out into the Slack channels. There was, so many events and holiday parties. Like the list went on and on. They were amazing. It was like, I'm sure Harvard Business Review will do some case studies about the culture that created an organization that allowed them to go public over time. But, looking through that, not every company has those resources. Not every company has the technological capabilities to launch something like that. And I became absolutely obsessed. And so I wanted to take the learnings and the amazing things that were driven by human capital, put it in technology, and make it scalable and easy for companies, whether you're 10 employees or 2,500 employees. I wanted to make it really easy for you to adopt a tool like this, just have the impact be felt immediately. So that's kind of the origin story, just an obsession with culture myself and seeing what it could do to people and their emotional state and just their drive. A happy employee goes beyond the job description. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah. So it's good to understand the origin, right? The reason why. Pragmatically, though, this was a moonlight exercise, right?
Yes.
And what were the top couple of challenges in doing it that way, and how did you overcome them? And the reason I ask is some of the people who are listening, are in that corporate job now and are looking at how are they going to get to be an entrepreneur, or they're about to embark on it. So it could be helpful to a few people.
Yeah, I would say first and foremost, do your job well. Don't slack on both things. Don't half-ass both things. It doesn't get you where you need to go. But I will say, the founders of ZipRecruiter were truly amazing entrepreneurs, and they actually moonlit ZipRecruiter while working at other companies. So truthfully, I learned the idea from the founders themselves and got inspired by the playbook. And when you're around unbelievable entrepreneurs, you can't help but feeling inspired. People always talk about where do you go in life has a lot to do with your network, and it absolutely does. If you're with people who take initiative, then likelihood is you're going to do it. And so the way it actually worked, I wanted to start with a platform that can increase communication at an organization, but very structured, not like Slack, just very structured, maybe announcements or posts. I wanted to increase recognition and rewards, gamify a recognition program. And I wanted to give people kind of career development opportunities with like very, very lightweight feedback. And I thought we can do it nights and weekends. I was obsessed with, by the way, ZipRecruiter was incredible. They were on an IPO path. Like I just wasn't leaving. It just, it wasn't in the cards to leave during that kind of hyper scale, hyper growth, momentous occasion. That's kind of a once in a lifetime opportunity. And so the way it worked, I have 3 other co-founders. I am a non-technical co-founder. I have 3 other technical co-founders, 2 of which are engineers. One is a product leader who's actually at Honey, which also, by the way, couldn't leave there as well because Honey got bought by PayPal for $4 billion. So we both had exits looming, so couldn't immediately leave. But you can actually de-risk by getting something off the ground nights and weekends. And that's really what we did. We just kind of gave up a little bit of our nights, weekends, and free times to build something we believed in, but it was fun. It wasn't like I was forced to do this and hated it. I loved it. We were talking to customers, we were getting customers to pre-buy in. And by the way, that was one of the biggest advantages we did. I went around to some of the tech leaders I know. I said, if we build this thing, not only will you use it, but will you pay for it? We didn't want the person to use it for free because the advice you're going to get is different if you're not motivated financially to give honest feedback. If you're paying for it, you want a great service. And so it did take a while, a period of a little over a year from, beginning phases, development, getting it out in the market. All of that actually happened while, working nights and weekends at ZipRecruiter. And so once we had traction though, once we launched it, the usage is off the charts. Over 90% of people were actively using it on a monthly basis. And so if it becomes part of your company's culture, the VCs started to hear about it, other companies started to hear about it. It kind of spread by word of mouth. And so I was getting kind of pinged left and right by VCs, like, take the money, take the money. And we were bootstrapped. So, raising money wasn't really the idea at first, but enough people heard about it that it became a reality.
So I want to unpack a few things here because I think there's a lot. There was a rich segment there. First is life advice. Who you fly with definitely dictates kind of where you go, right? So you surround yourself with good humans who are trying to achieve something in the world. That's going to be sort of the filter you see life through, right?
How do you feel about that, Ken? Would you agree? Or would you disagree?
No, I would, but I don't know. I don't think many people are intentional about who, like the 5 or 10 people they surround themselves with personally, or consider the impact on their future, who they work with and for. I think they look at what's close in on the screen. Here's the job, here's the money, here's the responsibility. That's the thing I want to do now. I don't necessarily think people consider the way one maybe should. What is the impact on me kind of over time? And I think part of it is, people stay in jobs for so short an amount of time today, like the contemporary workplace experiences, 1 to 3 years in a workplace, right? So I just don't know if there's long-term thinking being encouraged. So I think it's great. So that's kind of one, who you surround yourself with, really important. And then I think being willing to sacrifice a little bit. You're going to have to give up, not as much beer pong going to happen if you're going to start a company as a young person. And I think the other thing, and maybe it's worth trying to unpack, is how do you get the right kind of attention for your product? And that might also be a bit of intentionality in terms of who do you ask to be your first customers. So if you ask companies to be your first customers that are part of the VC ecosystem, you almost lay the groundwork for those folks to hear about you. There was a lot there. I just wanted to sort of pull that apart. I wonder what you think about that last bit about like picking your alpha users, if you will. Was that lucky or was it intentional?
I would love to tell you it was completely intentional, but no, it was a little bit lucky of just who was willing to take it. In the early days, I couldn't be as selective with who wanted to try out my product. So I would have taken anything in the very early days. But the truth is, you need one person to take a risk, because the next person you talk to, you can leverage that first person and say, hey, they're doing it. Let me tell you about the results they got. Nobody wants to be the first. And then when you have a handful of companies, I'll tell you the first 5 were the hardest. The hardest companies we ever adopted were the first 5. Because once we had 5, I could say, let me tell you what these companies are doing. And people from different verticals are like, how does it work here? And I had examples. I can actually speak to real life cases and people can feel it. If you're overwhelmingly confident because you've done it, it's very different than going into something for the first time. So the first company was the hardest. The first 5 were as hard as they've ever been. And of course, once you create a repeatable motion, obviously things become much easier after that.
Yeah. So let's move on a little bit, but not too far. I want to understand how your perception of the problem that Assembly solves has changed as this customer base has become much larger and varied.
Yeah, I will say the original problem of wanting to replicate amazing culture into organizations that don't have the resources or the money to invest into it, it's still top priority today. But the macro environment has dynamically changed since we started this thing. I couldn't have predicted we'd have a global pandemic and office culture would have gone down to historic lows. Office life we're going to have essentially a commercial real estate collapse this year. And it's because people aren't going back to the office. Hybrid work is pretty much the norm. Almost every company we talk to, unless it's retail or hospitality or, plumbing, whatever it might be, you might have to be on location or in the office. But almost every other company is at a minimum hybrid now. It's become the norm. It is the norm. It's here to stay. It's not a path that we're just going to revert back to. So I will say When you move to a hybrid work environment, you do have to look into asynchronous communication. So the tools that everybody uses, Slack, Microsoft Teams, are an amazing place to start, but that is phenomenal for instant chatting. How do you go beyond? How do you create structured communication? How do you make sure recognition is prolific? How do you make sure managers have a good dialogue with their coworkers? How do you make sure there are fun activities beyond just a Zoom happy hour that people can connect with one another? How do you make sure there are opportunities for, showing off your inner personality when you're really not spending time with your coworkers? So you have to look to asynchronous communication tools like Assembly. And sitting behind our entire program is a massive reward catalog. So not only do we encourage these things, but we gamify it and incentivize participation. So we're seeing astronomical participation results when you combine the psychology of doing something that people inherently want to do, but incentivizing them to do it.
Yeah, I was just thinking about, the old school, motivation companies like Merritt's Motivation. I don't even know if they're still even around. But they used to publish this big, thick catalog. And, if you were in the president's gold circle, you got so many points, you could,
Sure.
get a guitar or something out of the catalog. But this was a very flat, sort of a two-dimensional kind of thing. But it's a really interesting evolution of that category. And perhaps there is a greater imperative. And I'm wondering, how do you at Assembly, what is the messaging strategy to make this, a must-have instead of a nice-to-have? How are you communicating your passion for this in a way that, a business owner or general manager can get excited about?
Yeah, there's an interesting part to engagement, some of which is hard to quantify, right? What does engagement mean? If you ask people what does engagement mean, you're going to get a lot of different answers. And that's just the truth of it. But there are things that are easily quantifiable. And the nice part about our system, and the reason we actually have forms in our system, is to prove the ROI. So if you run a survey pre-launching Assembly and you run a survey post-launching Assembly, you could see a pretty dramatic uptick in feeling appreciated consistently across the workforce, feeling more engaged, feeling more tied to the company core values. Feeling heard is one of the biggest things in the dialogue with your manager. And so in particular on feeling heard, most companies have a survey tool of sorts. You can use us for surveys, even though it's not our primary use case. But one of the forms that almost every company does use, if you're in office, a lot of companies used to have this like physical anonymous suggestion box where you can write a little note, drop it in. But the problem with that is you can actually see someone going to the box. You can recognize their handwriting. And if you see one person, there's only one note in there, you really know who it is. But with Assembly's forms, you can write an anonymous suggestion. We can route it to HR, we can route it to leadership or just the CEO. And then you can actually have an anonymous conversation back and forth to understand not only what's the problem, but get to the root cause of why and what can we do to prevent it. Making people not only feel appreciated and connected to coworkers, but allowing them opportunities to feel heard. It's hard to argue that there's no impact there to connecting coworkers, to feeling appreciated, to feeling heard, to giving career opportunities. It's a pretty easy discussion, and the move to remote work has exacerbated and accelerated the path to making engagement platforms like Assembly far more valuable in the ecosystem.
So, when we started talking, I told you that I felt this problem pretty acutely, right? And I think we brought it up in the episode itself as well, especially as it relates to, early career folks. And I'm wondering, you said you do research. I mean, are you using that as part of your messaging and go-to-market strategy? Is the research like driving a thought leadership campaign for Assembly?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many avenues for that. Of course, our research helps dictate, but oftentimes the most valuable thing is actually different than the marketing campaign. So we can tell you all the stats of why it's so important. But truthfully, people hear something, or Gallup is one of the biggest survey companies out there that people refer to, or Harvard Business Review publishes an article. They're like, you need an employee recognition tool. So actually the key terms, employee recognition for small business tools, for medium-sized business, employee recognition or engagement platforms that integrate into your HRIS system. Nobody wants to use a platform that's not integrated into the tools that they're already used to using. So that form of marketing drives an unbelievable amount of inbound leads. And we're constantly creating content. We've been creating content. It's an investment that every company should start early, knowing that you're not going to see the results for quite some time. It's one of those things where you have to start investing early, knowing that you might not see it for 6 months, you might not see it for a year, But if you build the content mill, if you become a thought leader in the space, eventually your organic traffic and your organic presence will skyrocket and will pay tremendous dividends. And we've seen that. The organic traffic to the assembly site has been building for years and years. And we're growing hundreds and hundreds of percent per month in terms of our organic presence on the internet.
Wow. Well, so that was a great endorsement of content marketing. I want to thank you for that. We're going to bottle this little bit of video.
Yeah. Shout out to our Katya Hill, our marketing lead here at Assembly.
Awesome. It's great to hear, and it happens from time to time, a CEO sort of pound the table for marketing. We had a client early on in the business who he had 6 divisional presidents and their bonuses depended on spending their advertising budget. So you guys are few and far between the ones who truly pound the table. Speaking about budgets, how did raising money change your go-to-market strategy? This is something that you talked about in the prep session, but I think it'd be worth talking about what the before and after looked like a little bit, if you don't mind.
Yeah. So when we started, we were bootstrapped. We got our first companies in the door and actually profitable on day one because we had companies, paying us on day one. As I told you, we didn't give it away for free. We're like, we got into legitimate companies. They were paying us. And from day one, it's profitable. In a company like Assembly, your gross margin is way above 90%. So the actual cost to operate the business is pretty de minimis. And we had full-time jobs. So there were no real operating expenses either, other than AWS storage. But they give you so many perks if you work with a VC firm that you actually get most of the operating expenses for free, which is kind of interesting. So I would say at first we were very conservative and had to run everything on a profitable basis, which actually does stymie growth. It just kind of stalls it for a little bit. You can't accelerate fast enough. And the biggest unlock is once we did raise money, we had the messaging pretty dialed in. But once we were able to advertise, things just started exploding. The inbound leads grew dynamically. So it was really 100% inbound play to start. Once we raised capital, the beginning, I was, personally doing all the outreach to companies, send 100 emails a day, get rejected 99 or 98% of the time, get a couple demos out of them, set up a couple demos a week. Some of them will close. The funnel was tough in the beginning. It was a lot of elbow grease, I would say. A little bit easier now.
The unaided outbound is really a tough road.
Really a tough road.
Absolutely. Let's talk about current affairs a little bit. How's economic uncertainty affecting SaaS businesses, and what are you guys doing to mitigate the impact of the economy on the business?
So if you think about the SaaS winter, it's like the economic collapse that might be happening to real estate. I would say it already happened for a lot of technology companies. You've seen mass layoffs and budget contraction. I mean, there's just so much stuff that happened in the tech sector. So I would say, mid 22 is really when it hit the fan for SaaS companies. Net revenue retention and expansion was the thing for the last 10 years in a zero or low interest rate environment. Every company was expanding and growing, but it's mid-June, July 2022, the world just kind of stopped. You saw Salesforce contracting and all these companies contracting. The All In podcast, which is a big, business podcast that a lot of tech leaders listen to, they're talking about everyone's got to cut budgets. Everyone has to cut spend. Everyone should go to their vendors and mitigate costs. Thankfully, we were pretty early in the life cycle. We were growing pretty, aggressively. I would say we were so young that we kind of bulldozed through some of the collapse, but we did feel it. In the beginning, when we started at the beginning of the pandemic, we would probably have 150, 180% net revenue retention if we did nothing. So we'd grow 80% a year if we added no more sales, just because companies weren't going under. Everyone was adding seats and people pay us on a per seat basis. But come June, July 2022 is the exact opposite. The word contraction wasn't a thing in investor calls. And now every VC is talking about contraction. Companies are going out of business. And so you have to now add significantly more new business to the top line to supplement some of the companies that are shrinking or companies that are just going out of business, especially if you operate in, a lot of our companies are 200 people, 50 people, 500 people, 1,000 people. And a lot of the smaller companies, whether they lived or died, is a toss-up. And so I would say we were lucky that we were earlier on in our growth phase and we ripped through it. But it does feel like budgets are starting to open up again. It feels like the uncertainty was actually more of the problem than the economy itself. If interest rates are going to be high and they're here to stay, people are more comfortable with that. then I don't know where the interest rate hikes are going to stop. I don't know if they're going to lower them, so on and so forth. So I would say the lack of certainty, uncertainty very specifically, is the cause for a lot of the like SaaS, depression that we had. But it does feel like things have actually hit the corner for technology companies. And now it's really on the up again. Thankfully, we ripped through all of it and have continued to grow every single month for our, we haven't had a down month ever. So, knocking on wood, knocking on everything. Let's keep that trend up.
It's interesting. We see the same thing. Definitely the economic activity, business activity for us is up. And, this year it's like, it became January and all of a sudden, people are all of a sudden wanting to get busy in a way that, a year and a half earlier, there was a little bit of crickets from time to time.
Yeah. So. I think the scarcity mindset, Facebook kind of set the tone by laying off so many people, at least in the tech sector. It's like, if you're at the company, we want you to work. And what happened at Twitter? We're trimming the fat. So if you're at a company now, you're working. And for those who made it through some of the layoffs and the cuts, we want to make sure you are there, you're giving it your all. And tools like Assembly make sure those people feel appreciated, make sure they feel heard, make sure they have career progression, make sure they feel connected. So for those who made it through, we're a great solution for an asynchronous culture.
Hey, one last question before we end the episode. I'd love to know if there's a decision you made along the way that you would take back if you could, and give us a reason why.
Yeah, I would say when we started, we were less intentional of the 5-year plan than we should have been. I was pretty young, same with the co-founders that I have, and we were so eager to jump into it to solve a problem rather than fully understanding the landscape, the competitors, the problems in the space, the buyer set in particular, and what the buyers want. So buyers are often different than users. Like if you're selling a t-shirt, the buyer is the user. So it's pretty simple. You market to that one person. But with a lot of HR and engagement tools, the buyer, who's HR, has a very different, dynamic than the user itself. So what they want might not actually be what the employees want at all. And so that dichotomy is pretty hard to navigate. So I wish I understood that a little bit more. I wish I had more intention. And if I ever did launch another company from scratch, the diligence I would do into the space and the feedback and the customer, interviews would be extraordinary. I would not that I went in blind, but I went in, I would say, a little bit ignorant and have learned from those mistakes. But intention is the word I would say when you start a company, to understand a little bit more thoroughly where the trajectory is, the problems, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, that's a great place to land. And thanks so much for sharing as you did today. If people want to reach you or want to learn more about Assembly, how can they do that?
Yeah, so go to joinassembly.com. You can book a demo, talk to a sales rep. You can reach out to me. It's jonathan@joinassembly.com. Happy to chat with anyone if they have questions or just want to learn more about the business.
Thanks so much. And if you want to reach me, I'm on LinkedIn/in/Ken Lempit or KL@austinlawrence.com. If you haven't subscribed to the podcast yet, please subscribe to SaaS Backwards, wherever you get your podcasts. And thanks so much for listening. And Jonathan, thanks so much for joining us today on SaaS Backwards.
Hey, thanks for having me. It's a great time.
Thanks for listening to the SaaS Backwards podcast, brought to you by Austin Lawrence Group. We're a growth marketing agency that helps SaaS firms reduce churn, accelerate sales, and generate demand. Learn more about us at www.austinlawrence.com. You can email Ken Lempit at kl@austinlawrence.com about any SaaS marketing or customer retention subject. We hope you'll subscribe, and thanks again for listening.